Hello, Dr. Mark P. here, Muscles Unlimited. Today I'm going to talk about one set to a failure. Those advocates who truly utilize high intensity training realize that one set to a failure misses the mark and falls short of reaching its objective. Many of the proponents of the one set to a failure method, in their effort to debunk other more conventional methods, implying that they're very dogmatic and linear in their thinking, replace a lot of the dogma with their own. Because any singular application over time is very self-limiting in terms of the way the body adapts to it. You know, the body adapting to stress very handily and very readily, whether it be one set to a failure or any other method or application, the body will soon come to a point of diminishing returns. I look at the analogy of running a race, for example, and as it applies to comparing it to one's attempt to reach their objective using one set to a failure. Let's say you're running a 4-minute, you're attempting to run a mile. And so you break out into a full run at very high speed. Well, after a couple hundred yards, you're going to taper off. You're not going to be able to sustain that speed for a very long period of time. And if you continue doing so, you will not be able to finish the race at all. But instead, anyone attempting to run that distance will do so incrementally. You know, they'll taper their time as such to be able to achieve the entire distance in as short a period as possible. Which is, not to compare the analogy between long distance running to bodybuilding. However, in terms of being able to incorporate as much intensity into the smallest window of opportunity possible, it's a very similar analogy. Again, with one set to a failure, it just fails to do that. There's no way that, in my opinion, that there can be enough accomplished in the way of muscular contractions that will have been achieved that will therefore stimulate an optimum number of muscle fibers necessary to stimulate maximum muscle growth. As far as failure goes to, that's another thing that has to be considered. Many people like to use the word till failure, but what does that really mean? Momentary muscular failure is not necessarily failure. So you have to validate, okay, let's say you're justifying the one set to a failure. Are you really working to a failure? There are many ways to extend failure way and above and beyond. There are many intensity inducing techniques that most of us are very familiar with. So the question is, to begin with, before we even continue to discuss one set to a failure, is if in fact the trainee is working till maximum muscular failure to begin with. So another thing I'd consider in making my observation, my opinion about one set to a failure is what I call training tolerance and threshold. Threshold is a term that I've kind of coined the phrase, and what I mean by that is basically the point whereby the muscle has reached a point where, well, it's kind of analogous to the glass is full. A glass can only hold so much water. It's full, it overflows. That's pretty much all it can stand. Well, threshold is just reaching a point whereby the body will have already been exposed to enough proper exercise whereby it's pretty much all it can stand, all that's required to optimally stimulate progress. Now, for anyone to dictate or determine how much volume is necessary to achieve that, I think it's just way too subjective to definitively put a number on that, because there are other factors involved too. Tolerance, for example. Whether or not people want to agree or not, in my opinion, I feel that certain muscles simply have a greater tolerance for more exercise than others. And, from my own personal experience, which is a pretty comprehensive one, I'm going to give you a little analogy and then walk you through this and maybe see if you might agree to disagree. For example, when I do legs, I always proceed my squats with leg presses. And I like to do 3 working sets. After my warm-ups, I'll do a relatively higher repetition set, followed by, pyramiding, an incremental increase in resistance, naturally doing less repetitions. Then I'll do a 3rd set, which is my quote-unquote heavy set, overload set. This is heavy leg day, mind you. Then I'll go into my squats. Now, I use relatively heavy poundages for squats. After a period of time, let's face it, we work up to some pretty heavy weights when we're doing, pushing the envelope and doing high-power bodybuilding. So, let's say, for example, I do my first set of maybe, perhaps between 17 and 20 repetitions till failure. At that point, with such heavy weight, I'm virtually exhausted. It just takes everything out of me. I feel like the first thing I got to do is sit down or lay down, and actually the cascade of pain actually increases as time goes on. It doesn't get better. It actually gets more painful as the seconds go by. Sometimes I'm sitting there writhing in pain for up to 2 minutes before my breathing goes back to normal, and I'm even able to consider doing a second set. So at that point, I like to increase the resistance a little bit, do slightly less repetitions, possibly an assisted set at that point in time. But after that, that's pretty much it. For the most part, I've got absolutely 0 left to continue to do another set. At most, I might do a drop set using less weight than I did on my first initial working set. And that's a struggle. So really, if you look at it, you could call it 3 sets, if you will, but essentially the first set was probably the most productive set, but that was all done preceding another exercise, which leads me to another topic. There's some proponents out there that seem to think that one could literally exclusively over time select one exercise per muscle group, and provided they did enough volume, enough sets for that movement, that would be adequate enough to comprehensively stimulate that muscle. I tend to disagree there, and I'll give you my opinion as to why. Because one thing that I notice about my training is that I can have worked my initial movement. Let's say I'll go back to leg presses, for example, whereby I do 3 complete comprehensive sets to a failure, which you would think, for all intents and purposes, that by that time I will have totally preconditioned every muscle, joint, connective tissue from top to bottom. But then why is it that by the time I move over to squats, I still have to warm up? I'm still not ready to go into my first set of heavy squats straight away. Reason being, because there are other components involved at that point. One exercise simply does not thoroughly and comprehensively affect the muscle completely from every angle. In my opinion, one does need to follow up with a minimum secondary movement. For the most part. There are some exceptions. Deadlifts, I'm not going to do more than 1 low back exercise. On heavy back day, I'll do my 3 or 4 sets of deadlifts. That's it. I'm pretty much wiped out, okay? But again, for the most part, for a lot of the other muscle groups, 2, even 3 movements, okay? Again, not to say that I'm prescribing any number of exercises or volume. It just so happens that I believe in working to a threshold. In other words, I go to the point, even though I'm going to failure, until my body's pretty much told me that I've had enough. And again, it goes back to tolerance. Why is it that I'm able to do more sets for, let's say, chest or back than I am for legs? I'm not really quite sure, but I do know that they do have a higher tolerance, and I do know that it takes more time and more volume for me to reach the threshold than it does for other muscle groups. And that's just a fact. And so I kind of go with that. Okay, so to finish my argument as to why I feel that one set to a failure is really not the way to go, let me ask you a question. And this is going out to all those one set to a failure advocates. If someone were to tell you, sir or ma'am, if you have, no, see, I fucked that up. So in closing, in my argument concerning one-set toe failure, for all those proponents of that system, I have a question for you. If someone were to say to you that you have to gain a half inch on your arms in 90 days, because if you don't, your firstborn is going to be sold into slavery. Let me ask you a question. What do you think you'd do? Would you do one set to a failure, or would you do multiple sets and just pound the you-know-what out of your body with multiple sets for that period of time in your attempt to achieve your goal? Well, that being said, I think that kind of answers your question. So anyway, everybody, I'd like to sign off for now. And as Bruce Lee said, see, I fucked that up too. And as Bruce Lee said, using no way is way, and limitation is no limitation.